All right. Thank you for joining us tonight for the virtual presentation of vampire myth. We have heard about vampires in today's culture, from Bram Stoker's Dracula to Twilight Saga, shows us how vampires change from being fearful to romanticizing. We have with us Professor Jennifer Camden from the University of Indianapolis, and she will help us examine the origin of European folklore on vampires of the 19th century in fiction and popular cultures today. Welcome, Professor Camden.
Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you to you and Candace and to the Monticello Library for having me. I'm so delighted to get to talk about vampires. And hello to the rest of you out there in the universe. Thanks for joining us. As Tina said, I'm Dr. Jen Camden. I'm the Beverly J. Pitts Distinguished Professor of the Strain Honors College and Professor and Associate Chair of the Department of English at University of Indianapolis. My area of expertise is 19th century British literature, and that's how I came to vampires. As the Twilight novels started coming out, I saw an opportunity to capitalize really on their popularity to get students interested in 19th century British vampires. And so I taught my first vampire narratives course, and that really opened up an interest for me in the Gothic more broadly and vampire fiction in particular. So it's really fun for me to get to kind of move beyond that scope in tonight's talk. So tonight I'm going to kind of divide us up into three categories. First, I'll look at those folklore origins, as Tina mentioned, and then I'll switch into 19th century Anglophone literature. And then finally, I'll kind of turn to the kind of broader cultural questions that vampires bring to light, looking forward into contemporary literature and culture as well. As you can see this image on the slide, this is a suspected vampire burial. I'm not sure how clearly you can make it out, but the skeleton has a stake through the heart. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of defining our term vampire. So I'm going to limit myself to vampires that are called vampires, and I'll explain the etymology of the term and why that's an important distinction to make. So going back to ancient Greece, we've always had stories of demons or spirits that share some of the attributes that we now associate with vampires. So if you think about the ancient Greek Lamia, who steal children and eat them, you can certainly see how that might resonate with, say, Stoker's Lucy, the bloofer lady who steals children and feeds on them. But we don't have that term vampire until much later. So when I started to think about tonight's presentation, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary, and if you're not familiar with it, one of the wonderful things about the OED is that they'll track the recorded usages of the word and how the meaning of a word might change over time. So for the OED, they suggest that the first recorded use of the word vampire in English is in the 1740s, that it comes to the English language from the French, and that it comes to the French. And you can see even in the OED definition in the PowerPoint here that there's some vagueness here, right? A word of Slavonic origin that shows up in multiple Eastern European languages in variations. And I was kind of fascinated by that, right? That we can't really pinpoint the moment when we started calling vampires vampires. And so I looked a little further, and the scholar Katharina Wilson has an article in the Journal of the History of Ideas where she sort of traces these debates about the etymology, the origin of the word. And she charts out 4 different schools of thought. So there's a 19th century Austrian linguist who suggests that the word is derived from a Turkish word for witch, excuse me. There are German contemporaries of the 18th century vampire craze that I'll talk about in a minute who suggest an ancient Greek origin. There are contemporary English and American writers who posit a Hungarian origin, which Wilson says is factually impossible because the word doesn't enter that language until later. And then finally, the side she takes is contemporary linguists who suggest this kind of Slavic origin for the word. So you can see it in the quote on the slide here that part of the confusion is that a lot of the descriptions of vampires occur in Western European literature, describing what's happening in Eastern Europe. So we have this kind of back and forth transmission. And indeed, the word vampire enters a lot of these Eastern European languages because of the popularity of the first English language vampire narrative, John Polidori's The Vampire, which came out in 1819. So when we're talking about vampires, in some ways, we're always reading back from those 19th century novels to these folkloric origins. And so I want to talk a little bit about where these 19th century novels got their concept of the vampire. So a little bit of history here. With the treaty, and I am not an Eastern European languages expert, so I'm going to butcher many pronunciations, and I apologize profoundly in advance for that. So with the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718, the Austrian Habsburg monarchy annexed most of Serbia and the northern parts of Bosnia, which had previously been part of the Ottoman Empire. And these remained in Austrian control until the Treaty of Belgrade in 1739. And so as part of this imperial prospect, they're sending out military officials, government officials to these provinces in Eastern Europe. And that's where they encounter the local superstition and folklore accounts of the vampire. And then these make their way back to the imperial center, to the Empress Maria Theresa, through the reports of these officials. And then in turn, those reports get circulated more widely throughout Western Europe. And so I'm just going to highlight two early and important cases here. The first is the 1725 report of Imperial Provisor Frombald. And he ends up in this kind of horrible situation where he shows up in this village and they say, hey, we're going to exhume a vampire and we need you and the priest to be there. And he tries to suggest that they go back to the officials at the kind of local government office and wait. But they make the very reasonable counter argument, like, well, we can't wait. Otherwise, there will be more vampires and more deaths. So he sends his report back of kind of being co-opted into watching this exhumation and desecration of the corpse of the suspected vampire. Similarly, in 1732, Flickinger's report, Diesener Perton Seen and Discovered, tells a very similar story about him being in this local community, hearing of the suspected vampire, and then is asked to witness the exhumation and the killing of the vampire. And so reports like these make their way back to Empress Maria Theresa, who in turn then eventually sends two other physicians to investigate, her professor of anatomy, Johannes Gasser, and the court physician, Christian Bobst. And so their report prompts her personal physician, Gerald Van Swieten, to write a kind of statement debunking vampires as mythological. And her personal physician then encourages her to create laws essentially outlining many of these behaviors that are associated with the pursuit of vampires. So these reports then, as I said, circulate back into Western Europe and are kind of foundational for those literary narratives that I'll talk about soon. But before I get there, I want to talk briefly about some of the scientific explanations, right, that these folk superstitions and beliefs are trying to explain phenomena that they're witnessing. So some have posited porphyria or rabies as explanations for the vampire characteristics. And those are kind of outlier theories at present. There are some consistencies, but on the whole, it seems that this mythology grows out of misunderstandings or lack of knowledge about how disease is transmitted and how the body decomposes after death. So if you think about decomposition, just to really get us into the gory stuff, some of the characteristics associated with vampires were bodies that were unnaturally preserved after death. And this is a particularly problematic one, since this is also a criteria for sainthood, right? The body that remains fresh after death is an indication of the person's saintliness. And then separately, also blood around the nose and mouth, right, which might seem to indicate the vampiric feeding of the vampire, is also connected to how the body decomposes. And just to go fully gross, right, the stake through the heart and the body that would emit like a gasp is the release of gases that build up during decomposition. So you see how these communities were trying to explain phenomena that they witnessed. Similarly, I think we're all really sensitive to this now, living through a pandemic, the idea of the vampire as being able to make other vampires, right? We see this aspect of contagion that can in some ways be traced back to a lack of understanding about disease transmission at the time. And indeed, one thing that I didn't know of before I started thinking about this talk that I find really fascinating is that we think of this vampire panic in 18th century Eastern Europe, but there's one almost 100 years later in 19th century New England, and I'm just like fascinated by this. When we can travel again, I want to go visit these places and learn more. But there's this spate of exhumations connected to suspected vampires that scholars now think and folklorists now think is connected to tuberculosis outbreaks at the time. And so here's the grave of one of the victims who was purported to be a vampire. And there's some really sad but also interesting documentation of how her family is sort of responding to pressure from the community to exhume her body and to put her through these, rituals to kill the vampire. And they're just put in a difficult position where they feel this social pressure to conform to the community's wishes as they're trying to explain, sudden deaths of people who previously had seemed healthy. And I've been talking about vampires as if there's something located in the distant past, but if you've been following the news, there also have been in much more recent times reports of vampires in Malawi and lynch mobs that come out to try to execute the vampires. And there are lots of different theories and rationales for why this might be happening there. Some have suggested that these vampire panics are linked to droughts, that farmers are looking for a scapegoat to explain climate change, and turn to Black magic practitioners and to local folk superstition. Others have pointed to suspicions of Western aid, in particular a group of medical researchers who were attacked for having information materials used to draw blood. And so we see again, this kind of cultural clash here. So I want to turn now then to thinking about vampires in literature as sort of a bridge to thinking about how vampires function in culture. And I'm just going to walk you through some of my favorite 19th century Anglophone vampire texts. I'm not going to give any away spoilers because my hope is that after I sort of tease each of the texts that you will want to read them for yourselves, but I want to introduce them so we can start thinking about some of the larger metaphors and thematic concerns. And so here on this slide, I have an image from Edward Gorey's illustrations for Dracula, which are just simply delightful. So as I mentioned previously, the first Anglophone vampire narrative is John Polidori's The Vampire, published in 1819. And Polidori is kind of an interesting figure in and of himself. He's Lord Byron, the poet Lord Byron's physician, and he happens to be with Byron and Percy and Mary Shelley. 19th century lit fans will know these names, as they're all vacationing together at a villa, and it's literally a dark and stormy night, much like tonight, and they challenge each other to write ghost stories, and this is sort of the famous point of origin for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Polidori wrote The Vampire in response to this dare, but when it was initially published, people just assumed that Byron had written it, in part because the protagonist, Lord Ruthven, bears certain, maybe not quite flattering similarities to Byron. You'll remember the famous epithet ascribed to Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and Lord Ruthven certainly fits some of that criteria. So Ruthven preys on aristocratic women in England, and then also throughout Europe. They journey to Rome and later to Greece. And interestingly, he always chooses those who are set up as kind of paragons of virtue for his victims. So there are women who are described as being kind of easy or on the make or promiscuous, and he avoids them and really goes for women who are held up as virtuous. His seductions also linked to financial vampirism. Whenever he leaves communities, rumor follows that he also leaves debts in his wake. So you can see some of the key elements that we'll find in later vampire fiction here: an aristocrat who feeds off the wealth of others, a seducer who destroys his victims, and then maybe most importantly, kind of the thrill and allure and danger of the vampire is that you don't realize they're a vampire until it's too late. So I'm going to turn now to a mid-century text, and you can see here how the kind of popularization of vampire fiction. Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, is a title that I think seems more comic now than it was at the time. But this is a Victorian penny dreadful. So these are published serially and cheap, both cheap to produce and cheap to purchase, newspaper style accounts, right? Their authorship is really difficult to pin down because they were written by sort of a stable of hack writers who were hired just to keep churning these out. We think it's probably James Malcolm Rymer, but Thomas Prescott Prest has also been put forward as a candidate. And so you can see that these are written to appeal to a lower class, middle class readership who just, kind of ones, they're sometimes called penny bloods, right? Because of their emphasis on kind of gore and violence and a kind of quick thrill. I think they're maybe comparable to modern day soap opera or serial that will keep going as long as readers are interested. And so we see some of that in Varney. It is available. Wordsworth Classics has an edition. that's really reasonably priced, but you have to kind of set yourself up for about 800 pages of vampire fun. So if you pick this one up, I'd encourage you to read it like it's a 19th century audience and just take a little bit at a time, right? This is not a binge read, but a kind of slow luxury that you can read over time. So because of its sheer length and the length of publication, it came out over the course of 2 years. There are a lot of internal inconsistencies that are also, for me anyway, part of its charm. So we get multiple and competing origin narratives for our vampire. In one part of the plot, he's the victim of a kind of Frankenstein-inspired mad scientist who brings him back from the grave against his will. In another part, he's turned by a mysterious traveling stranger, right? So you see some of the xenophobic elements there. And yet in another, vampirism is a punishment for crime. So he sort of accidentally murders someone, and he's visited by these spirits who say, well, now you're going to be a vampire in restitution for your poor behavior. But the plot, despite being pretty episodic and quirky, does have two main narrative arcs. And when I teach this novel, I usually just excerpt those more coherent pieces of the narrative. There's lots of trippy and fun stuff in between, but in terms of like having a story arc to follow, in the first part of the novel, we're following Barney's persecution of a neighboring aristocratic family, the Bannerworths, and particularly the beautiful Flora. And then in a later section, we get kind of a repetition with the difference of that narrative, where Varney finds himself the guest of another aristocratic family with beautiful daughters. And he ultimately turns one of the two daughters, Clara Crofton. And there's this like fabulous scene where she emerges from the family tomb and her betrothed, who's like hyper eligible, you know, the man to marry, is sitting there and he's like, take me with you, Clara, turn me too. And she just turns and walks away. And in fact, she goes on to feed on other women, right? So I think there's lots of things to think about there about Clara sort of rejecting the conventional life for a middle class or aristocratic woman and choosing or continuing with this different vein. And so in both of these plots, interestingly, Barney finds sympathy, right? He's not vilified in the way that Ribbon is. Eventually, Flora Bannerworth comes to pity him and indeed at one point protects him from an angry mob of villagers and helps him escape. And then at the end of the novel as well, I won't give away the surprise twist of the conclusion, but shortly before the end, he befriends a local priest who's sort of held up as someone who's more open-minded than the community, and he tells him his story and has a sympathetic audience. So again, kind of moving through the 19th century, Carmilla is by the Irish writer Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, comes out in 1872. And this one introduces the element of the frame narrative. And so if you've read Dracula, and I'll talk about its narrative structure in a bit, you know that part of its charm is that we get different voices speaking in different media. And I think we see that starting in Carmilla. It's framed by the doctor who treats our protagonist for nerves. And then he sort of introduces her story. So our protagonist here is Laura, who lives in Styria with her father. And he's got a really interesting and complex backstory. He's an English widower who's retired from the Austrian army and has purchased this castle, this Schloss in Styria. And so one of his old friends is supposed to visit, bringing his ward, a young girl in his care, but the girl dies unexpectedly. And so the novel sort of opens with Laura recounting how she'd been looking forward to this visit that's now not going to happen. And then by happenstance, a carriage crashes at their front gates containing the beautiful Carmilla and an older woman who's sort of presented ambiguously as like mother, chaperone. It's really unclear what their relationship is. And she sort of imposes in a wonderfully sort of passive aggressive way. She gets them to invite Carmilla to stay with them, but not to ask any questions about who she is or where she's from. And so Laura and Carmilla begin this kind of deep and intense friendship. They recognize one another from dreams they had when they were children. And this friendship quickly shifts into the erotic, and it's always initiated by Carmilla, and Laura sort of recounts her attraction and revulsion to Carmilla's advances. And then of course, Laura starts to waste away. And I won't tell you how it ends, but hopefully that inspires you to read more. And then finally, Dracula, 1897, probably the best known 19th century vampire narrative. But I hope you can see how it's coming after really a century of vampire narratives. The images that I have on the slide are from the Baby Lit series. There are so many delightful, terrifying, sexy images of Dracula that I thought I'd go a completely different direction and show you how Dracula's been reimagined as children's literature. This is a counting primer. So it kind of walks you through. You can see one castle, two friends as a way of teaching numbers. So Dracula, if you haven't read it, the novel opens with our solicitor hero, Jonathan Harker, who's on his way to Transylvania by train at the behest of his employer. And as he's on this journey, he keeps encountering these locals who are making all kinds of signs at him and giving him crucifixes and expressing concern for his well-being. And he's got that sense of foreboding and doom. But when he gets to Castle Dracula, he's initially charmed by the Count, and then starts to notice odd things happening. For example, the Count is making up his bed and cooking his dinner, like kind of surreptitiously doing all the work that usually would be done by servants. They're staying up all night talking, so they're all sleeping all day long. And as he starts to try to explore the castle, he realizes that rooms are locked. When he falls asleep in one room on accident, he has this kind of dream / waking nightmare where he's the prey of 3 vampire vixens until the Count shows up and warns them off. So he eventually comes to realize, kind of overcome his initial attempt to rationalize these occurrences, realizes that the Count's a vampire, that he's his prisoner, and that the Count is plotting an invasion of England. Meanwhile, in the coastal resort town, fishing village of Whitby, Harker's fiancée, Mina, is on vacation with her friend Lucy, and Lucy's a vivacious young woman who's entertaining 3 suitors and receives marriage proposals from all 3. A young American oil man, kind of self-made man, a doctor, and then an aristocrat, a lord-to-be, and she ends up choosing the lord-to-be. But after a mysterious shipwreck, she starts to sleepwalk and look unwell, and her former suitor, the doctor, brings in Van Helsing, his former professor, to see what they can do. So again, I don't want to spoil it further if you haven't read Dracula, but hopefully you'll be curious to see what happens to Lucy and whether Jonathan Harker ever gets out of Castle Dracula. So here I want to turn just to think about vampires in culture. And in that slide, you can see I've just put up a brief sampling of contemporary vampire fiction, 20th and 21st century vampire fiction. And I think there's, for me, that kind of point of origin, there's a kind of spurt with Interview with a Vampire, and then another burst of fiction in the wake of the publication of the Twilight Saga. And so I thought it would just help to close my portion of our talk, and then I would love to talk collectively with you through Q&A about how vampires function as metaphors for anxieties or fears. And so I'll start with maybe the most straightforward is vampires as a way of thinking through anxieties about sexuality. So in Dracula, Dracula plays on Lucy, who's represented as potentially promiscuous. But part of Lucy's promiscuity, right? These 3 suitors, those 3 suitors also give her blood transfusions. So she has the blood of 3 men in her. And then when Dracula feeds on her, he's also feeding on them, right? And so that sort of complicates any straight reading of that relationship. And of course, as I mentioned before, Dracula warns the vampire woman away from Harker and claims him as his own. So we see how the novel sort of policing sexual behaviors as appropriate or dangerous. Similarly, in Carmilla, we see her preying on Laura and other young women. Riven in Polydorus the Vampire preys on women, but he spends most of the novel traipsing around Europe with Aubrey, right? So the women sort of have a different function maybe than his friendship with Aubrey. And of course, Interview with a Vampire, to bring it into contemporary fiction, has often been read in light of the AIDS epidemic. And Twilight, I think, has really interesting things to say about abstinence, right? That's its contribution to the way vampire narratives think about sexuality. I think certainly in Dracula, we also see xenophobia, anxieties about a foreign invasion, right? That all of our vampires are to some degree outsiders to the communities on which they prey, but Dracula particularly is a foreigner who's coming to English shores and has asked Harker to teach him how to blend in, to make sure his speech doesn't have any foreign mannerisms. He's hired multiple solicitors so that no one knows exactly what he owns and what his plans are. So there's a kind of concern about the foreigner who's able to invade and assimilate. Vampires have also been read in terms of anxieties about social mobility. So in the 19th century in particular, if you think about, just a second, yeah, please shut the door. I can't talk right now. No. Sorry, that's my daughter Emma making a guest cameo in our presentation. So social mobility, if you think about what happens in the 19th century, we move from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. People move to cities. There's the rise of the middle class, a lot of new wealth. And so 19th century vampire fiction certainly thinks through how to make sense of these social upheavals and what to do with an aristocracy that may be seen as outdated and as preying on others. So Dracula himself is a consummate aristocrat. He's very proud of his lineage. His castle is full of these piles of dusty gold that are not out in the community, right? They're just hoarded there by him. And so maybe it's no surprise that he's taken down, I guess that is a bit of a spoiler, by our kind of middle class heroes, right? The lawyer, the doctor. Similarly, Lara lives in a castle which they can only afford because it's cheaper to live in the continent. And I won't give away Carmilla's true identity other than to tell you that she's revealed to be an aristocratic woman, right, of ancient lineage. So again, we see this tension between kind of a new middle class and an old aristocracy. And then finally, I think vampires also can express anxieties about technology. So many of these novels in different ways imagine a confrontation between old and new ways of doing and knowing. And that's especially true in Dracula. So the new technologies are set up against old superstitions, the phonograph, the telegraph, the ways in which these characters not only record their narratives, but then travel, by ship, by train, reveal anxieties about a shrinking world and the threat of contagion in a global economy, which might feel really eerily resonant in our current pandemic moment. In Polidori's The Vampire contrasts the Greek folk superstition, this kind of folk knowledge possessed by the young innocent Ianthe, with the European characters' desires for a rational explanation, and they ignore her kind of old world knowledge at their peril. And so I'll just end my monologue with a quote from the noted scholar Nina Auerbach's Our Vampires Ourselves that maybe will open up other avenues for discussion. So this book came out during, I think, the first Bush administration. And so, but I think it maybe also is relevant today. So she says, vampires and American presidents began to converge in my imagination, not because I think all presidents are equally vampiric, but because both are personifications of their age. So I think, when we turn to vampire fiction, we see how they're reflecting the anxieties and the concerns of the moment in which they're written. So thank you so much. I've enjoyed the opportunity to wax on about vampires, and I can't wait to talk to you more.
Okay, thank you, Professor Camden, for doing this program with us. If you love reading or watching anything about vampires, we have all kinds of books like Vampires of Today, talking about vampires of modern day cultures. You've got the Twilight series, there's Interview with the Vampire, the movie, you also have the book of it, and Vampire Diaries books or the TV series. We have all kinds of stuff about vampires. So please like this video and also follow us on Facebook for upcoming events and programs. So thank you so much, Professor Camden.
Oh, thank you so much, Tina. It's been a delight.